install upgrade scripts and set up resources. So set up resources, install upgrade scripts. This is how we do stuff to the database in Magento, essentially. So let's take a look at the workflow, and then we're actually going to do some touching of the database ourselves. And just like other things in Magento, usually you're going to have some typos, so we'll look at that at the process of getting through that. Okay, so overview. Magento install scripts, which are analogous to a picture of a sunlit crane on an iPhone. Stuff's being done here. They're building stuff. That's what we do. So there's basically two modes here. There are installs, which are only run once, and there are upgrades. So basically, the rule of thumb is once your module has had an installer run, it will never run. Another install script would never be run. You only run upgrade scripts. So tactically, they're the exact same thing. As I was saying, once Magento runs an installer script for a module, it'll never run another installer for that module again. Essentially, once our module setup node has been saved into core resource, from that point on, we only run upgrade scripts. And this is the structure. So that mean little poll block from earlier, we have our SQL folder, little SQL, and then another folder underneath it. We'll look at what that folder needs to be named in the configuration. Where else would it come from? And then inside here, we just have this format, okay? Mm-hmm. Install script, upgrade script, upgrade script. So all of these will begin with MySQL 4 dash. Again, the naming convention. An install script will have install, and then upgrade scripts will have upgrade. And then for install scripts, we only specify a single version number. And this version number is evaluated using PHP's version compare function, which will handle different versioning conventions, but obviously you would want to test. I'd never choose to integrate any kind of letters or anything. I always use numbers, and you'll see Magento always uses numbers as well. And then for the upgrade scripts, you list a version number and then dash another version number. And these are all PHP files. SQL files will work, but don't do it.
You mean .SQL?
.SQL, yes, .SQL. So, and another thing of note, you don't actually have to go in some sort of integer sequence here. It's just lower values going to higher values. Or in the case of rollback scripts, higher values going to lower values. So, of course, we need configuration. So, that folder under SQL, that folder name, is the node name under resources. So here we've specified checkout setup under a resources node, and we'll look at the full configuration here in a moment. And then inside this node here, specify setup. So the system effectively is going to look inside of resources for our set of instructions. And inside of our set of instructions, we'll look for the setup node where we specify the module we'll be using and the class we'll be using. So, and it's okay to use another module setup if your module has similar functionality. Most of the time you'll use either a core resource setup, or if you have an EAV entity, you'll use the EAV entity setup. Okay? So apply all updates. Remember that from Mage. Just looks in global resources for the children and then processes them. So that's the configuration being evaluated.
Are we learning this just to know how the internal work is?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. So once again, background information. Your takeaway from this slide, though, should be the thing to remember from the slide. Whatever you have here for a node value becomes the folder under SQL. So if I had Mage checkout set up, I would need Mage checkout set up.
Okay.
Is Mage run calls Mage core model app run. We remember that from the initialization exercise or lesson. Mage core resource setup, apply all updates. So this happens very early in the execution of the application. This checks the version, the current version of the module and the configuration, which could be cached. So if you're changing version numbers, just like anything else in the configuration, you'll need to refresh your cache. But looks in the core resource table, which we'll look at in just a moment. So if the version in our configuration is different from the version in core resource, well, then Magento will look to see, actually checks to see if the value is higher or lower, and then searches for an appropriately named migration script. Okay. Yeah. Install scripts. This is by convention, and it makes sense. We may actually want to use a different class inside of our file, but by convention, you always most of the time will see this even in the core. We reference this with installer, and again, this is our setup class. A lot of the times, you won't need a custom setup class. The example we'll be doing, we won't use anything other than the core setup class. So there's three things you need in your install script. You need start setup, so installer start setup, installer run, which is where we actually run our SQL, and then installer end setup. Okay? So that's the takeaway from this slide. That's the structure you'll have inside your install and upgrade scripts. And the cool thing is, this is all very, it's all basically the same whether you're using a simple entity or an EAV entity. So, you can pass, we'll be doing something very similar to this in a moment. So, this is a good example of an installer script. Now, what is often the case is you might find that you'll add a drop table if it exists. In an installer file, this is okay, because if that file is being run, that means that the installer hasn't been run yet for this site, or for this Magento install. So here we reference, and there we set up a nice little, this is how we inform our IDE what this variable is, so this will give us some code completion. All right, so in here we use our curly braces. We use installer, get table, poll in this example. So what this does is goes and gets the table value from the configuration for the poll entity. And the nice thing about this is that if the Magento install is using table prefixes, this will prepend those prefixes for us. This is why you wouldn't reference your table name directly. And then this is just simple SQL. Yeah. So start setup, run, end setup, and this is what the version number configuration looks like. And the reason we don't put this in our activation file is because it doesn't make sense there. It would work there, but we shouldn't need to change our activation file to switch version numbers. All right. So there's actually another option. You can use DDL, and there is down in Varian data DB DDL, I believe. There's an entire data definition language. It's pretty good, but there are some issues. One that I'm aware of, I think, is that setting auto increment doesn't work through it. It was a nice thought, but typically typically module developers are using SQL. Yeah. Yes. So data install is a little different. It's basically the same thing, but basically the same thing, but data installs execute after the store. Basically, the big difference is data installs occur after the stores have been initialized, and that's done that way so that in the event that we have a multi-language site and we need to install data for different languages, we can use those store objects to do that and have those store values. So this is really, data installs exist for scoping. And that's really the big difference between the two. Yeah. And that file would be named, MySQL for data install instead of install or data upgrade. So rollback is possible, and again, that's just the only noticeable difference between a rollback script and an upgrade script is that you might go from 0.7.0 to 0.7.1 for an upgrade, and a rollback would be 0.7.1 to 0.7.0. It's never implemented in the core. They don't do this. Now, so for EAV entities, we'll want to extend from Mage EAV model entity setup because that will give us access to get default entities. So here we can actually set up our attributes for our entity. We'll be looking at this actually as part of the exercise. And there's just this. So basically, for each attribute, you specify an array of arrays of options under this attributes index. It's a bit cumbersome. The good thing is there are plenty of examples of the core doing this, so you can generally find out. But here you see we specify an entity model, an increment model. So we associate, for catalog product, okay, we're going to use EAV entity increment numeric. All right. So attributes. Okay, name. Well, that's going to be a text attribute. Here's its label, and it's a required attribute, for example. So we will be doing this in just a moment. Like now. All right. So.
This one's great.
So first thing we need to do, I'll walk through this with you guys. So create an install script and a data upgrade script. Okay. Create an install script for the module that creates a table. So this is what we've been waiting for, right? Okay. Well, let's make a table for our animal entity, right? We want to take that code for a spin and see that it actually works.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Let me see here. All right. Let's see. So this is the rest of our configuration. So in our global node, remember that configuration is inspected under global resources. We have training animal setup. Simply another unique node for us to use. But this one, of course, this will be the value that shows up in core resource table and will also be the folder name underneath our SQL folder in our module.
Why not just training setup?
Go for it.
Yeah.
And here we're specifying for our module as well as the setup class that we want to use. And we have a simple entity, and it's going to be just using the core resource setup class. again, if we needed to do anything complex, we would be more than welcome to use our own setup class, which would extend from either Mage Core Model Resource Setup or Mage EAV Model Entity. I think I would know that by now. Entity setup. Yes. Okay, I was right. So this would be the EAV class, which extends from core resource setup. But again, that class exists to give us access to the to all the attribute models. So you should have something roughly like this. I will roll this up a bit. Okay. Now, before I go and set a version number, we're being good Magento developers and we're aliasing this. Again, this script is included, not unlike templates being included in blocks. This is being included in Mage Core Model Resource Setup. So we alias this with installer, start setup, run, end setup, and then in here we simply have our SQL.
Where is this now?
Ah, good question. And what is it named? It is
MySQL for install -install -1.w.
So in our module, under the SQL folder, we have to use that node of ours under resources. So I'm sure Adam's going to use training setup instead of training animal setup.
Yeah, I know.
And then MySQL 4 install dash 0.1.0.php. So you can imagine what my install or what my version number would have to be for this to trigger. 0.1.0. So, all right, let's break down what we're doing here. Obviously, you guys recognize SQL, okay? But the only thing we're doing here is we are adding in, we're quoting in our table. So the installer uses function getTable to read the table name from the configuration, and we'll also return it with that table prefix if Magento is so configured. And then how do we get the script to run? You've done this before. Too many times. Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of wise to leave, you know, however you have access to your SQL environment, just leave that open so you can clear out the core resource table. So obviously, once we have that entry, this script would never be run again. So if we wanted to develop a perfect script, well, so looks like I can just probably hit my site here. Go to the home page. All right, and then first place I could check would be hey, 2.1. Oh, that must be old. So that probably wouldn't have run. Huh. Did I 2.1? Oh, maybe I have modules deployed somewhere else in here. Oh, I do. Ah. I overwrote my own version number. But, hey, that was a 2.1, right? So, but I didn't have anything in there.
Like, go back.
But no, it just ran the installer because the current version, yeah, because it wasn't installed. It has a version number, right?
Yeah, it doesn't really care what version, it's just a stock version.
Yeah. Well, I better check that that's true. Let's see. Do I have a training animal entity? Look, I do. Look at that. Oh, sweet. Okay. So here's the config XML again. Version number. So if your module is not installed, i.e. record in core resource, then the system will look for an install script with version number that is less than or equal to the version specified in config. Okay? So an example of this would be config version of 0.2.1 and script version of less than or equal to 0.2.1, i.e. MySQL 4 install 0.1.0. That's less than 0.2.1 dot PHP. And those of you using something like NetBeans, by the way, if you don't specify that .php at the end, it becomes a .0 file. So, and after that, it's upgrade scripts. Okay? So that is, does everyone have a table? No.
I have a core resource, but I don't have a table.
Ah.
I don't even have a core resource. My team doesn't have it.
Okay. Wow. Didn't I give you guys the code to...
Verbatim.
Gosh. Okay. Well, first thing to check. Do we have a SQL folder under training animal? Next thing to check, does the folder under the SQL folder, does that folder name match whatever we have under the resources node? Is our resources node actually resources and not resource? And does it rest comfortably inside the global node? And then, does our module name here match the module name for our version in the modules node under config? And if you specified this class, did you specify it correctly? Probably yes, or else you would have seen an error. Will look like. So say we want to append, we want to alter the table, okay? And I'll paste this as well. So I've added it to the end of that document here, okay? So.
What is it called?
Yeah, what's the name of that file?
The URL?
So, SQL training animal setup. So again, a file, sibling file of this install script, MySQL 4-data-upgrade, and here I'm going to have to change the version number since I'm already at 2.1. I think, or wait a minute. No, it's actually this will work.
No, you need to
No, I need to go from
go
2.1 to something. So I'm going to go from 2.1 to 2.3. So if you check that type with me page, I just added that to the bottom.
So to make the script run again, we can just change the version.
No, we're doing an upgrade though. Yeah, you would. But if you wanted to do that, well, if you want to make that script run again, the install script, you'd have to remove the entry from core resource.
You don't want that, just name rename to upgrade basically.
Uh-huh. Wow.
You wouldn't obviously want to drop in there, but
So currently my data version is the same as my module version, 2.1, 2.1. And then the only thing I would need to do to get this to run would be, so currently my module 0.2.1, I've got a script set for 2.1 to 2.3. I could even specify it be 2.2. It's just really, again, just a comparison. You don't need to go in sequence. So if I change my module version to, let's say, 2.5, refresh any page.
I need to see the upgrade script.
The version number must be higher or equal to the one that you have in the file name.